Hello and welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Richard Podkowski. So Richard has had a varied career. He's worked for the US Secret Service, worked for large corporate, and he's also an author. So welcome, Richard. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for the opportunity to be a Midlife Man.
Great, thank you. Well, Richard, I mentioned you've had a very interesting career. Do you want to start off by talking us through that?
Yeah, so I'm a retired special agent with the United States Secret Service, which is a federal law enforcement agency. And the Secret Service is a dual mission agency. So protection of government officials, both visiting foreign heads of state and the U.S. president and other senior leaders. And the Secret Service also investigates as a dual mission, primarily financial crimes, very, very involved in cybersecurity now and, combating what's evolving as cyber crimes on the internet, and also involved in the protective intelligence world where service monitors threats against these venues, and also what is targeted violence now, both domestically and internationally. I know that's a lot of words, Philip, but basically agents conduct criminal investigations and protection.
So would it be fair to say then, Richard, that you've had, fairly high levels of high pressure job? We've been doing very important things, especially, in the Secret Service and working in law enforcement capacity. How have you managed the high pressure world that you've lived in for most of your life?
Well, the first thing I'll tell you is men and women in law enforcement, whether you're a municipal police officer in a big city or small town, a state law enforcement officer, people in law enforcement are under constant stress. And it differs from, agency to agency. But, things like working shift work, long hours, in our case, traveling abroad, traveling domestically. I think all these things contribute to the stress that men and women in law enforcement can experience and often do. There is I call it the societal stigma for law enforcement that they're, being viewed, that there's a fear that they're being viewed as weak or not being able to handle their job and their roles and responsibilities. I think that's, one of the things that, is very, true to the profession. And, oftentimes, again, men and women in law enforcement, they're supposed to be 20 feet tall and bulletproof. So, but the problems are, enduring stress for a long period of time can often lead to anxiety, depression, or even symptoms that resemble post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which affects the military and really people, people from different walks of life. You could even see it in the world of medicine. Nurses, doctors, technicians who work long hours, and although they don't feel the necessary stresses of someone in law enforcement, but these can have what I believe are physiological effects on people. Sleeping and eating disorders. Feeling withdrawn, self-absorbed. Oftentimes maybe even leading to irritability. In your personal relationships, and even in the world of your professional associations as well.
So in the world, tough world of law enforcement, you've already said you're expected to be, able to take on a lot of pressure, taking a lot of things. So would you say that generally, there's support if you want to discuss or talk about some of these, talk about stress and some of the problems associated with the job? Is there a stigma against doing that, or is it pretty open and supportive?
So, my career spanned the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the early 2000s. And I would say in my era, employee assistance programs were just starting and evolving. And I think that I'll just, comment on my experience. Well, I think, first of all, that EAP programs, both in the private sector and the public sector, are wonderful resources. And in the early days, if you engaged with EAP resources, whether it was just a counselor, maybe the provision of social services, as an ancillary resource, from, people outside the mental health world, even just, doctors that would look at, things like diet, your diet, nutrition, stress management, sleeplessness, those issues. I think that at that, as EAP evolved, there was a societal stigma that you could not handle the stresses of your job, which then would indicate that, hey, you know what? Maybe you're not cut out for this line of work. And I think that, early on, there was a lot of reluctance for men and women to get into EAP support programs until, I would say, now it's not looked upon that way. I think, people who engage in outside help, let's call it, there was the whole confidentiality piece. There should be confidentiality about your engagement with these resources. And I think overall, based on what I hear, what I see, I'm not active duty law enforcement anymore, but I don't think the societal stigma is as prevalent as it was in the past. At least that's my opinion.
And when we talked before, you talked about the kind of rubber gun syndrome.
Yes, I think, that's a term that some people may have heard, someone who was experiencing, in law enforcement, someone who was experiencing these types of issues where there's an EAP intervention, or even before an EAP intervention, someone in the agency will say, usually at a higher level will say, hey, we have to remove this person, from their current role, put them in a less stressful role until, perhaps, there's intervention by these mental health resources or whatever program is out there to address that person's issue.
So what happens then when, you don't necessarily feel you can share your mental health pressures? You don't feel you got the right outlets. What do you do? What do you do to relieve the stress?
Me personally?
Yeah. How did that work?
Well, so one of the things that works for me and is almost a daily routine for me is fitness. I follow a pretty regimented fitness program. And I will say that at my age, which is the shady side of 60, let's say, the fitness for me is I think my primary outlet for stress and anxiety. I would consider myself a type A personality, an overachiever. My mind works in creative ways these days, and fitness is my first. I love to ride my bicycle. I have a road bike. I live in Southern California, the Los Angeles area. There's a lot of opportunities to ride my bike in different locations, and I take full advantage of it. The other thing for me is I write. I'm a writer, debut author. And I also have a unique interest, and that's making Christmas ornaments. I make a Christmas ornament every year for about the last 20 years. And what it helps me do is it's a project, and I have to plan it. Some of these take me 3 months, to make. And it makes me focus, and it makes me focus on something other than, the stresses of everyday life. And I was doing this, even when I was, ending my law enforcement career. So I think for me, I look for diversions. And even in retirement, I worked in corporate security. I've done strategic security consulting, some private executive protection. And I just find that for me, stepping away from the pressures that I experienced in law enforcement and even in private sector security, just gave me, a different perspective other than living, but oftentimes law enforcement officers do. They live it 24/7 and can't touch.
I guess this is where, poor relationships with alcohol and other sorts of, release mechanisms comes into play as a stress reliever.
Yes. So, alcohol consumption, excessive consumption, can sometimes be a release for people in law enforcement and other professions. And what it does is sometimes or oftentimes it's an ability to fit in with your peer group. If you spend a lot of time with your colleagues, there's almost like a brotherhood or sisterhood, because you're all living the same life and the same stresses. And, that engagement with alcohol as a release can often lead to, problematic, drinking behaviors, habits. But, alcohol could be viewed as a coping mechanism, I think, for people, that have these professional anxieties.
And do you think that's heightened where you've got really high pressure roles, as in, working in Secret Service and working in law enforcement and some of the other sectors you talked about? I mean, it must be difficult to find ways of not taking the job home.
Well, it is. And I think for me, in my experience, what I did, because I did have a unique law enforcement career, and subjected to all those, potential problems that arise, sleeplessness, working long hours, traveling abroad, coming back, you're in different time zones. When you're out working in advanced planning for security, there's a lot of responsibility there. And you don't want to fail. You can't fail in your job because someone's going to get hurt, whether it's a colleague or, someone else at a particular location or event. And ultimately, the people that we are charged with protecting. So there's a lot of stress there. And, police officers, for instance, it's a little bit of a different stress, I think, because you're dealing with spontaneous events that you have to handle, whether it's a radio call to a domestic disturbance situation, or, you encounter an accident victim or, worse, violent crime victim. I think those stresses are very real for the men and women in law enforcement. And even on our job, when we worked criminal investigations, oftentimes if you did a search warrant, an arrest warrant, or you were interviewing a potential person that wanted to do harm, you were in harm's way or potentially in harm's way. And, dealing with that stress and the aftermath, I mean, those were realities that we had to deal with. And that's where you have to be able to have, a release when you can from those pressures and, just try to have a work-life balance. I think it's important, for people in law enforcement or high-stress jobs and other professions to maintain a work-life balance. And I think that awareness, just around the world now is a prevalent theme, or at least it should be for people.
And do you think that can lead to, long-term stress, anxiety, leads to having more severe mental health issues? So did you see that more in your profession, or?
Well, yes. I mean, I think our world has gotten much more complex than it was, 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, with the advent of social media, instant communication these days. I think the stresses that particularly, men and women in law enforcement encounter today could be different than they were even, 10 years ago. So, being able to, awareness is the first thing. And even when an individual is not aware, having someone that can be sensitive, to someone who might need help, and then provide, encouragement to, to take advantage of getting help.
So you talked earlier about coping mechanisms, and you personally, use exercise to help relieve stress, but you've also been writing for most of your life, and you're a new published your debut novel. So how did writing become part of your life then? What's your journey to now being a published author?
So I've always had a creative mind, and I'll just say something about my father. My father has been long deceased now for over 20 years. And, he came from Poland, born in Poland, as was my mother. And my dad, my parents lived through World War II, which of course, was a horrific time for everyone. And he was a very practical, pragmatic man. Worked as a printer. He was a printer. That was his career, his profession. But then he was also an artist. He was very creative. He loved to oil paintings and watercolors and, pen and ink etchings. And I think for him it was a release. I remember as a boy, he would go down in our basement and had his easel, and, he'd light up a cigarette and he would just stand there and paint. And I would sit there and watch him, as did, my sisters. And I just saw, I think it was an escape for him. Obviously, he was very talented. And I think I inherited some of his abilities. I don't do oil paintings, but I've done some drawing, and for me, it's the manual, the Christmas ornaments. I think that's my release, my escape, and it gives me an ability to express my creative talents. Now, with regard to writing, I started writing, I think, like any kid, you have to write stories in grammar school, and I actually had a writing class in high school. So short stories, and then in college, in university in Chicago, I took a couple of writing courses, and I think my professors back then, because I wanted to go into law enforcement. And by the way, I wanted to be a police officer. Early on, I studied criminal justice in college at Loyola University in Chicago, and I eventually wrote very detailed reports in law enforcement. And the creative writing, even in college, one of my professors said, I did a short story he gave me an A on, and I'm like, wow. And then his comments were, I remember his name, Dr. Macy, and he said, did you really write this? And I took that as a compliment. So I really didn't do any creative writing until just after I retired, 20 years ago. And I just had, I think along the way, I had ideas that were formulating in my head. And I had this idea for my novel. I'll hold it up, The Walk On. See my name. You can see a couple of images there. That's my protagonist, Mike the Steel Man Stolowski. And he's carrying a football helmet. And this is downtown Chicago. He's walking along the lakefront, along an area they call Oak Street Beach. And this young lady, as a part of the story, very prominent, and her name was Kim, and that's all I'll tell you. But this is a story of redemption, personal redemption for this person. And it involves romance, tragedy, some lighthearted moments. I just got a 5-star review, so I'm happy about that. But for me, this story popped into my head and began really, really engaging it out of my thought 2007, so over 16 years ago. And that was at a time when professional athletes, especially in the world of professional football, seemed to be stories appearing in the media, some athletes making some very poor choices. And it gave me the impetus for this story. And I just built characters, real life characters based in the city that I grew up in. And I was told, by people that are accomplished authors said, hey, write what you know. So I wrote what I know. And it took me, it was a journey. I was raising, 2 kids, working full time, in my other private sector jobs. And I would often write late at night, sometimes early in the morning, or catch as catch can. And it took me a long time. I walked away from it for 3 years, and then decided to finish it when I had an opportunity. Kids went away to college, and was fortunate, to have a publisher believe in the story, and then the debut novel came out this past February. Now, in the interim, I have also written some short stories. I wrote another story completely opposite of this novel, and it's a Christmas romantic comedy titled Operation Santa Bear. And it's about a police officer and a nurse, and pretty formulaic romantic comedy that I'm hoping to push to the next level. And then I'm actually working on a crime story now, and it's kind of loosely based on my experiences as a task force supervisor in the Secret Service, where I worked with other law enforcement agencies, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. We're mission oriented and we're some pretty complex criminal investigations. So I guess writing for me has evolved into what is a passion now. And I intend to continue to write as time allows. And it seems like my creative juices are really, boiling up now, and I opened up Pandora's box. So let's see where it goes from here.
And how much you said, you should write what you know, or the advice was to write what you know. How much of you is in the protagonist in the Waterfront?
Okay. So as I tell people, there's some of my DNA in my protagonist, and I don't want to give the story away, but my character works in a high pressure, as a professional athlete, constant media scrutiny, good and bad, uses alcohol and, banned substances, let's say, to maintain his level of play, late in his career. So he's subjected to the trials and tribulations and stresses, anxiety of being a professional athlete, as well as, the physical toll it takes on one's body. So I guess in a roundabout manner, what I'm trying to say, Philip, instead of telling the time I'm building the clock here, but yeah, there's some of my DNA, and there's a lot of, in writing what I know, I tried to put my character, other characters, and experiences and locations that I know well.
Did you find it a kind of cathartic experience writing the novel?
I would say yes. Yes, on several fronts. I incorporated things like my protagonist's father is from Europe, from Poland, obviously. He's got a Polish last name, Stolowski. Blue-collar kid, grew up in the steel mill areas of Chicago. Steel mill area where steel was produced, and a lot of immigrants actually worked there, from the mid-1800s until, I'd say, the late 1970s, when the mills shut down. Very tight-knit neighborhood. But as far as catharsis, obviously this story popped into my head, and the overall theme of personal redemption, and I framed it. I framed the story around a professional athlete who was subjected to all these stresses and anxieties, physical manifestations, and I think it was cathartic for me. I think I had a story inside I had to tell, and this is what came out.
So, what advice would you have, based on your experience, to people listening to this podcast they're working in high pressure environments, struggling to cope with, the associated stress, maybe starting to have an impact on their mental health. What advice would you give them based on your experience? What should they do?
Well, I think the overall comment that I have there is people oftentimes around you can see things that you don't, and understand that you're being affected by, whatever it is. It could be alcohol, it could be the use of illicit drugs, it could be you being withdrawn, you're not the same that you were or should be. And oftentimes it's family members or close friends or professional associates, supervisors, etc. And I think that what I would advise, people in the situation is if somebody tells you that you need help or you need some type of intervention, some type of support, you should internalize it. But sometimes people don't know that they need help. But I would encourage everyone that if there are warning signs that someone's telling you about, the other thing I'll comment on that I haven't, you should take advantage of it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And, the societal stigmas, I think, have dissipated quite a bit for an individual. One thing that's happened, and it seems, I don't know, as a result maybe of all the the things that I was experienced in the last few years with COVID, it seems like suicides, at least I've seen in the world of law enforcement, especially with those men and women that experience the more concerning side, the violent crime, the, people that themselves might need, mental health support. This can lead, to the individual in law enforcement to not be able to cope. And you do see, I don't want to quote statistics because I'm not that well informed, but there is open source information out there, about, suicide being a concern, for men and women in law enforcement, potential concern. And the fact that intervention and support is out there. And these individuals should heed the warning signs and take advantage of getting help, which most often is the answer that someone may need.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for telling us about your career. Great to hear about your book, and hopefully we'll see more to come.
I have an author's website. It's richardpodkowski.com. If anyone is interested in reading about the reviews which I'm getting and learn a little bit more about myself, the book is also available for purchase through the website. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble Books, a couple other platforms.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Midlife Men, where my guest has been Richard Podkowski. If you want to find out more about Richard, you can visit his website, richardpodkowski.com, where you can also buy his debut novel, The Walk On, or you can also buy it through most online retailers, and we'll put the links on the website. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover in the podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, then please contact me either on Twitter @midlifemen or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Join me next time when we talk to other midlife men about their stories, and maybe you'll find that they resonate with you. Thank you.